The winter wind carved through the canyon like a blade, carrying with it the promise of death to any soul foolish enough to venture into its path. Snow blanketed the endless grasslands of the American frontier, transforming the familiar terrain into an alien wilderness where even the hardiest men questioned their chances of survival. In this unforgiving landscape, where the line between civilization and savagery blurred like smoke in a storm, a solitary cabin stood defiant against nature's wrath. Inside that weathered structure of pine logs and determination, 24-year-old ranch hand Jake Morrison pulled his frostbitten fingers closer to the flickering flames of his fireplace. The young cowboy had spent the better part of 3 days tracking down stray cattle through territory that most men wouldn't dare cross in broad daylight, let alone during a blizzard that had claimed the lives of 2 travelers just last week. His weathered face, prematurely aged by countless hours under the merciless frontier sun, bore the distinctive marks of a man who had learned to survive by his wits and his gun. Jake had built his life on solitude and self-reliance, two virtues that served a man well in this corner of Arizona territory, where the nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away and the closest town existed as little more than a collection of wooden buildings and broken dreams. He had purchased this land with money earned from years of dangerous work driving cattle across hostile territory, and he had sworn to make something of himself in a world that offered no guarantees to anyone, especially not to an orphan who had learned to ride before he could properly walk. But Jake's isolation had come at a price that he was only beginning to understand. The endless conversations with his horse and the sound of his own voice echoing off canyon walls had begun to wear on his spirit in ways that surprised him. Sometimes, during the long winter nights, he found himself wondering if a man could actually forget how to hold a proper conversation with another human being, or if the ability to trust someone else's judgment might atrophy from disuse like an unused muscle. The Apache people who had inhabited this land for generations before any white man had ever set foot in the territory remained a constant and unpredictable presence in Jake's daily calculations. Their warriors moved through the landscape like ghosts, appearing and disappearing according to patterns that seemed to follow no logic that European minds could comprehend. The uneasy truce that existed between the scattered white settlers and the various Apache bands depended entirely on mutual avoidance and the unspoken understanding that certain boundaries would never be crossed. Recent months had brought increasing tensions as more settlers arrived and the territorial government began making promises about Apache relocation that everyone knew they had neither the power nor the intention to fulfill. Jake had witnessed enough senseless violence on both sides to understand that the current peace hung by a thread so thin that a single misunderstood gesture or accidental trespass could unleash a wave of bloodshed that would consume everyone in its path. The tribal politics of the Apache bands added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. Chief Red Hawk, whose territory encompassed the land surrounding Jake's cabin, had managed to maintain relative peace through a combination of strategic wisdom and carefully controlled aggression. But his authority was constantly challenged by younger warriors who viewed any accommodation with white settlers as a betrayal of their ancestors and their future. Among Red Hawk's most significant challenges was his own daughter, a young woman named Aiyana whose intelligence and spirit had made her both a source of pride and a source of constant concern for her father. At 19 years old, she possessed a fierce independence that frequently put her at odds with traditional expectations about the proper role of women in Apache society. Her refusal to accept the arranged marriage that her father had negotiated with a powerful warrior from a neighboring band had created a crisis that threatened to undermine Red Hawk's authority and potentially destabilize the delicate alliances that kept their people safe. This was the powder keg into which fate would soon thrust two young people whose lives had been shaped by entirely different worlds, but who shared the same fundamental longing for something beyond the constraints that circumstances had placed upon them. Jake pulled off his boots and hung his gun belt on the wooden peg beside his bed, grateful beyond measure for the warmth that his small fire was beginning to generate throughout the single-room cabin. The storm outside had intensified during his ride home, and he estimated that the temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since sunset. No creature in its right mind would be moving around in weather like this, he thought to himself as he began to unbutton his heavy wool shirt. That was when he felt the movement in his bed. The sensation was so unexpected and so subtle that for a moment Jake convinced himself that exhaustion was playing tricks on his senses. But as he stood perfectly still, barely breathing, he detected the unmistakable presence of another human being beneath the heavy blankets of his crude but functional bed. His hand moved instinctively toward the location where his pistol normally rested at his hip, only to remember that he had just hung his gun belt across the room. Slowly, with the careful movements of a man who had learned that survival often depended on avoiding sudden gestures, Jake approached his bed and carefully pulled back the top blanket. What he saw there nearly stopped his heart completely and sent a jolt of pure adrenaline surging through his entire nervous system. An Apache woman lay curled beneath his covers, her long black hair spread across his pillow like spilled ink. Her face turned away from the firelight, but her breathing clearly audible in the sudden silence of the cabin. She was young, probably not much more than 20, and despite the fact that she was fully clothed in traditional buckskin clothing, her presence in his bed represented a situation that could easily result in both their deaths if anyone discovered it. Jake's mind raced through the possible explanations for this impossible scenario, but each theory seemed more unlikely than the last. Had she broken into his cabin while he was away? Was this some kind of trap designed to compromise him in the eyes of either her people or his? Had she been injured and sought shelter without realizing that this particular cabin belonged to a white man? The young woman stirred slightly, and Jake caught a glimpse of her profile in the dancing firelight. Even in her current state of exhaustion and what appeared to be hypothermia, she possessed a striking beauty that seemed to belong more to the realm of dreams than to the harsh reality of frontier survival. But more than her physical appearance, something in her posture suggested a strength of character that Jake recognized and instinctively respected. For several minutes, Jake stood frozen beside his bed, trying to process the implications of what he was witnessing and attempting to formulate some kind of rational response to an utterly irrational situation. Every instinct developed through years of frontier living told him to wake her immediately and demand an explanation for her presence. But something deeper, some intuitive understanding of human desperation that transcended cultural boundaries, whispered to him that this young woman had not arrived in his bed through choice but through necessity. The storm outside had reached a level of intensity that would make travel impossible for any creature larger than a rabbit. If she had been caught in this weather without adequate shelter, her options would have been limited to finding refuge or dying from exposure. Jake's cabin was the only structure within miles that could provide the kind of protection that she would need to survive until the storm passed. As if sensing his presence, the young woman suddenly opened her eyes and looked directly at him. Her gaze was alert and intelligent despite her obvious exhaustion, and Jake found himself looking into dark eyes that seemed to contain depths of experience and understanding that belonged to someone much older. For a long moment, neither of them spoke or moved, each taking the measure of the other while trying to assess the level of danger that this encounter might represent. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and her English was limited but surprisingly clear. "Please," she said, her body trembling from cold and perhaps from fear. "I am dying from the cold. I need warmth." Jake felt his heart constrict with an emotion that he could not immediately identify. Here was a young woman who had risked everything to save her own life, and her vulnerability in this moment transcended every boundary that society had constructed between their two peoples. But he also understood that the consequences of helping her could extend far beyond anything that either of them might anticipate. "Who are you?" he asked, keeping his voice as gentle as possible while remaining alert to any signs of deception or danger. "My name is Aiyana," she replied, struggling to control her shivering long enough to form the words clearly. "I am the daughter of Chief Red Hawk. I have been running for 2 days. I cannot feel my hands or my feet. If you send me away, I will die before sunrise." The implications of her words hit Jake like a physical blow to his chest. This was not just any Apache woman who had stumbled into his cabin. This was the daughter of the most powerful chief in the territory, a young woman whose disappearance had probably already triggered search parties and whose discovery in the bed of a white settler would almost certainly result in a war that would consume every living soul within 50 miles. But as Jake looked at her pale lips and the way her entire body shook with uncontrollable tremors, he realized that the immediate question was not about politics or consequences. The immediate question was whether he was the kind of man who could turn away from another human being's desperate need for help, regardless of the potential cost to himself. "You can stay until the storm passes," he heard himself saying, though a part of his mind wondered if he had lost his sanity completely. "But you need to understand what this means for both of us if anyone finds out you were here." Relief flooded across Aiyana's face, and Jake saw tears gathering in her dark eyes. "I understand," she whispered, "and I will never forget your kindness." Jake moved to the other side of the cabin and began arranging blankets on the floor near the fireplace, creating a sleeping area that would provide warmth while maintaining a respectful distance between them. But as he worked, he could not shake the feeling that he had just set in motion, a chain of events that would change his life in ways that he could not even begin to imagine. The wind outside howled with increased fury, as if nature itself was warning them about the forces they were about to unleash. Over the next several hours, as the storm continued its assault on the cabin, and Jake fed wood to the fire to maintain life-saving warmth, he began to learn the story behind Aiyana's desperate flight into the wilderness. Her English, though limited, was sufficient to communicate the essential details of her situation, and Jake found himself both impressed by her intelligence and horrified by the circumstances that had driven her to risk everything in search of freedom. Aiyana told him about the arranged marriage that her father had negotiated with Black Bear, a warrior from a neighboring band whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by his political ambitions. The alliance would strengthen both tribes and provide security in an increasingly dangerous world, but it would also condemn Aiyana to a life of subjugation, to a man who regarded women as property to be controlled rather than partners to be respected. "My father is a good man," she explained, her voice growing stronger as warmth returned to her body. "But he thinks like an old man who remembers the time when our people could live according to the ancient ways without interference from the outside world. He does not understand that the old ways will not protect us from what is coming." Jake found himself drawn into her story despite his awareness of the danger that their conversation represented. "What do you think is coming?" he asked, genuinely curious about her perspective on the changes that were transforming the territory. "More of your people will come," she said simply. "Many more, and they will want all of our land, not just the pieces they have taken already. My father believes that if he can create strong alliances between the Apache bands, we can resist this tide. But I have seen how your people fight, and I know that resistance will only delay the inevitable while causing much suffering." Her analysis of the situation impressed Jake with its clarity and realism. Most of the white settlers he knew refused to acknowledge that their presence in Apache territory might be viewed as anything other than an expression of divine will or manifest destiny. But Aiyana spoke about the conflict between their peoples with the detached objectivity of someone who had thought deeply about forces much larger than individual desires or grievances. "So you ran away rather than marry this black bear," Jake said, not quite making it a question. "I ran away rather than become a symbol of the old ways that will get my people killed," Aiyana corrected him. "Black Bear believes that Apache warriors can defeat any number of white soldiers if they fight with enough courage and ferocity. He wants to use marriage to me as a way of convincing my father to support a war that cannot be won." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. If Aiyana was right about Black Bear's intentions, then her escape had prevented more than just an unwanted marriage. It had potentially disrupted plans for a military campaign that would have resulted in massive casualties on both sides and the probable destruction of Red Hawk's entire band. "But your father must be searching for you," Jake pointed out, "and when he finds you here, he will have to choose between his duty as my father and his duty as a chief," Aiyana finished for him. "And I do not know which choice he will make." The weight of that uncertainty settled over both of them like a physical presence in the small cabin. Jake realized that he had committed himself to protecting not just a runaway Apache woman, but a person whose personal rebellion might determine the fate of everyone in the territory. The magnitude of that responsibility was both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. As the night wore on and their conversation continued, Jake began to recognize something in Aiyana that he had never encountered in another person. Like himself, she was someone who had been shaped by isolation and self-reliance, but who longed for a connection that transcended the limitations of her circumstances. She spoke about her dreams of a different kind of life with the same mixture of hope and resignation that Jake had always felt when contemplating his own future. "I used to imagine what it would be like to live in one of your towns," she admitted, her voice growing soft with something that might have been embarrassment. "Not because I want to become like white people, but because I want to choose my own path without having to consider how my choices will affect the survival of my entire people." Jake understood exactly what she meant. "I came out here because I wanted to build something that would be entirely mine," he told her. "But sometimes I wonder if complete independence is just another kind of prison." Their conversation was interrupted by a sound from outside that made both of them freeze with terror. It was the distinctive whinny of horses, muffled by the snow but clearly audible above the wind. Someone was approaching the cabin, and at this hour of the night, in this weather, visitors could only mean trouble of the most serious kind. Jake moved quickly to extinguish the oil lamp that had been providing additional light, leaving only the fire to illuminate the cabin. In the sudden dimness, he could see the fear in Aiyana's eyes, but also a steely determination that told him she would not go quietly if this turned out to be the end of their brief refuge from the world outside. "Hide behind the bed," Jake whispered, reaching for his gun belt. "And whatever happens, do not make a sound until I tell you it is safe." But even as he spoke those words, Jake knew that safety might be a luxury that neither of them would enjoy again. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and with it came the unmistakable feeling that their small sanctuary was about to be invaded by forces beyond their control. The horses came to a stop directly outside Jake's cabin, and through the single window he could see the flickering light of torches cutting through the swirling snow. Male voices carried on the wind, speaking in rapid Apache that Jake could not understand but whose urgency and anger were unmistakable. These were not casual travelers seeking shelter from the storm. Jake counted at least 4 distinct voices, which meant he was outnumbered by trained warriors, who knew this terrain better than he did, and who probably had good reasons for tracking someone to his remote cabin in the middle of a blizzard. His hand tightened on the grip of his Colt revolver, but he knew that drawing his weapon would likely turn this encounter into a gunfight that he had no realistic chance of surviving. A heavy fist pounded on his door with the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. "Open the door, white man." The voice spoke English with a heavy accent but perfect clarity. "We know you are inside." Jake glanced toward the area behind his bed, where Aiyana had hidden herself, but he could see no sign of her presence in the flickering firelight. For a moment, he allowed himself to hope that perhaps the Apache warriors were here for some other reason, that their arrival at his cabin was merely an unfortunate coincidence that could be resolved through careful diplomacy and mutual respect. "I am coming!" Jake called out, buying himself a few more seconds to think while he moved toward the door. But before he could reach it, the wooden barrier exploded inward, with a crash that sent splinters flying across the cabin floor. 4 Apache warriors entered his home with the fluid grace of men who were accustomed to violence and comfortable with the possibility that they might need to kill or be killed before this encounter was finished. The leader, a man whose scars and bearing identified him as someone who had survived many battles, stepped forward while his companions spread out to cover the room's exits and corners. "My name is Black Bear," the leader announced, confirming Jake's worst fears about the nature of this visit. "I am here to collect what belongs to me." Jake forced himself to remain calm despite the adrenaline that was surging through his system like liquid fire. "I do not know what you are talking about," he said, hoping that his voice sounded more confident than he felt. "I live here alone, and I have nothing that belongs to you or anyone else." Black Bear's smile contained no warmth or humor, only the cold satisfaction of a predator who had cornered his prey. "You lie with the same ease that all white men lie," he said. "But lies will not help you tonight. We have tracked the woman to this place, and we will not leave without her." Behind Black Bear, the other warriors began searching the cabin with systematic thoroughness, overturning furniture and examining every possible hiding place with the kind of methodical precision that suggested they had conducted this type of search many times before. Jake knew that it would only be a matter of minutes before they discovered Aiyana, and he tried desperately to think of some way to prevent the violent confrontation that seemed inevitable. "There is no woman here," Jake insisted, even as he heard one of the warriors moving toward the area near his bed. "You are welcome to search, but you will find nothing except a man trying to stay warm during a storm." Black Bear's expression did not change, But Jake detected a subtle shift in his posture that suggested the Apache warrior was preparing for action. "When we find her," Black Bear said quietly, "you will die slowly for the dishonor you have brought upon her by allowing her to share your bed. And she will learn that there are consequences for running away from responsibilities to her people." The casual cruelty in Black Bear's voice told Jake everything he needed to know about what would happen to Aiyana if she fell into this man's hands. Whatever political considerations had motivated her father to arrange this marriage, the reality was that Aiyana would be turned over to someone who viewed her defiance as a personal insult that required the harshest possible punishment. That realization crystallized Jake's thinking in ways that surprised him with their clarity. He had spent his entire adult life avoiding the kind of emotional entanglements that might compromise his independence and his ability to make rational decisions based purely on self-interest. But looking at Black Bear and his companions, Jake understood that some situations transcended individual concerns and demanded a response that had more to do with fundamental human decency than with personal survival. "She is not here," Jake repeated, stepping deliberately between Black Bear and the area where Aiyana was hiding. "And even if she was, I would not turn any woman over to a man who speaks about her the way you do." The words were out of his mouth before Jake fully realized that he had spoken them, and their implications hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. He had just declared his intention to protect Aiyana against her own people, a decision that could only end in violence and would almost certainly result in his death within the next few minutes. But instead of the immediate attack that Jake expected, Black Bear paused and studied him with something that might have been curiosity or respect. "You would die for an Apache woman?" he asked, as if the concept was so foreign to his experience that he needed to confirm his understanding. "I would die before I let you hurt someone who came to me for help," Jake replied, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "That has nothing to do with her being Apache and everything to do with her being human." Black Bear nodded slowly, as if Jake's answer had confirmed something that he had suspected. "Then you will have your wish," he said, reaching for the knife at his belt with movements that were almost casual in their deadly efficiency. But before Black Bear could draw his weapon, a voice from behind Jake's bed cut through the tension in the cabin like lightning splitting the sky. "Stop." Aiyana stepped into the firelight with her head held high and her dark eyes blazing with the kind of fierce dignity that Jake had glimpsed in their conversations but had never seen fully displayed. She was no longer the exhausted and frightened young woman who had sought refuge in his cabin. In this moment, she had transformed herself into something that commanded respect even from armed warriors who had come to capture her. "I am here, Black Bear," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But I am not yours to collect, and I will never be yours to own." Black Bear's hand paused on his knife handle, and Jake could see him recalculating the dynamics of the situation now that his quarry had revealed herself. "You have brought shame on your people by hiding in the bed of a white man," he said, but his tone had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Your father has promised you to me, and Apache law requires that you honor his decision." "Apache law requires that I honor agreements that serve the welfare of our people," Aiyana corrected him. "But marrying you would not serve anyone except your own ambitions. You want to use me as an excuse to start a war that will get our warriors killed and our children taken from us." The accuracy of her accusation clearly surprised Black Bear, and Jake could see him struggling to maintain his composure in the face of her direct challenge to his motives. "You speak like a foolish child who knows nothing about the responsibilities of leadership," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to Jake's ears. "I speak like someone who has thought carefully about the future of our people," Aiyana replied. "And that future does not include becoming the wife of a man who would sacrifice our entire band to satisfy his own pride." The two other Apache warriors who had been searching the cabin had stopped their work to listen to this exchange, and Jake could see uncertainty growing in their expressions. It was becoming clear that Aiyana's rebellion had deeper roots than simple defiance of an arranged marriage, and that her criticisms of Black Bear touched on concerns that other members of their community might share. Black Bear seemed to sense that he was losing control of the situation, and his hand moved closer to his knife. "Enough words," he said, his voice rising with anger. "You will come with us now, or I will kill this white man and take you anyway." But before anyone could move, the cabin door opened again, and a new voice cut through the tension with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. No one will be killed tonight. Chief Red Hawk entered the cabin with the measured pace of a man who had learned to project calm strength even in the most volatile situations. He was older than Jake had expected, probably close to 60, but his physical presence filled the small space with the kind of quiet power that made everyone else seem smaller by comparison. Behind Red Hawk came two more Apache warriors, but Jake immediately sensed that these men were different from Black Bear's companions. They carried themselves with the disciplined bearing of seasoned fighters who had learned to think before they acted, and their attention was focused primarily on Black Bear rather than on Jake or Aiyana. "Father," Aiyana said, and Jake heard a mixture of relief and apprehension in her voice that told him she was not entirely certain about how this unexpected development might change her situation. Red Hawk's gaze moved slowly around the cabin, taking in the overturned furniture, the weapons in various hands, and the obvious tension that filled the air like smoke. When his eyes met Jake's, the young cowboy felt himself being evaluated by someone whose experience and intelligence demanded respect regardless of any other considerations. "I am Red Hawk," the chief said, addressing Jake directly. "This is my daughter. Has she been harmed in any way?" The question was asked in a tone that suggested peaceful intentions, but Jake understood that his answer would determine whether this encounter ended in violence or negotiation. "No, sir," he replied. "She came here seeking shelter from the storm, and I have tried to help her as I would help anyone who was in danger." Red Hawk nodded, as if Jake's answer had confirmed something he already suspected. Then he turned to face Black Bear, and the temperature in the cabin seemed to drop several degrees. "You came to this man's home without my permission," Red Hawk said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made shouts unnecessary. "You threatened to kill him for showing hospitality to someone in need. And you spoke of taking my daughter by force, as if she were a horse to be stolen rather than a person deserving of respect." Black Bear's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, but he clearly understood that he was now facing someone whose authority superseded his own. "Your daughter has dishonored herself and her people," he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. "She cannot be allowed to escape the consequences of her actions. My daughter has shown courage and intelligence in avoiding a marriage that would have served no one's interests except your own," Red Hawk replied. "And this white man has shown more honor in one night than you have shown in the past year." The words hit Black Bear like physical blows, and Jake could see the warrior struggling to control his rage in the presence of his chief. But Red Hawk was not finished. "You will leave this place now," the chief continued, "and you will not return. The marriage alliance between our families is ended, and any attempt to interfere with my daughter's choices will be considered an act of aggression against me personally." Black Bear's hand moved to his knife again, but the two warriors who had accompanied Red Hawk stepped forward slightly, their own hands resting on their weapons in a gesture that was both subtle and unmistakable. After a moment of tense calculation, Black Bear apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. "This is not finished," he said, directing his words toward Aiyana rather than her father. "You cannot hide behind white men forever." "I am not hiding behind anyone," Aiyana replied with dignity that made Jake's chest tighten with admiration. "I am making my own choices about my own life, as every person has the right to do." Black Bear turned and stalked toward the door, followed by his companions, who seemed relieved to be leaving without bloodshed. But just before he crossed the threshold, he turned back to Jake with eyes that promised future trouble. "You have made an enemy tonight, white man," he said. "Remember that when the time comes to pay for your interference in Apache affairs." Then he was gone, and the cabin fell into a silence that seemed almost deafening after the tension of the past few minutes. Jake found himself alone with Chief Red Hawk, his two warriors, and Aiyana, facing a situation that was almost as dangerous as the one they had just avoided. Red Hawk studied his daughter for a long moment, and Jake could see emotions playing across the older man's weathered features that suggested an internal struggle between love and duty, between personal feelings and political necessities. "You have put me in a very difficult position," he said finally, and his voice carried the weariness of a leader who had been forced to make too many impossible choices. "Black Bear was not my first choice for your husband, but the alliance would have protected our people during the hard times that are coming." "Father," Aiyana began, but Red Hawk held up his hand to silence her. "Let me finish," he said. "I have spent many years learning to balance the needs of our people against the desires of individuals, including my own desires as your father. But tonight, watching you stand up to Black Bear and listening to you speak about the future of our band, I realized something important." He paused, and Jake held his breath, sensing that the next words would determine the fate of everyone in the cabin. "I realize that you have grown into a woman whose judgment I trust more than my own," Red Hawk continued. "And if you believe that marrying Black Bear would harm our people rather than help them, then perhaps I have been wrong about what our people actually need." Tears began to flow down Aiyana's cheeks, but she held her father's gaze steadily. "I do not want to be a burden to you or to our band," she said. "But I cannot live a life that denies everything I believe about what it means to be human." Red Hawk nodded slowly, then turned to face Jake. "And you, young man," he said, "what do you want from this situation?" The question caught Jake completely off guard. Throughout the entire confrontation, he had been focused on trying to survive from one moment to the next, without getting anyone killed. He had not allowed himself to think about what he might want beyond immediate safety for himself and Aiyana. But now, forced to articulate his desires in the presence of people whose lives would be affected by his answer, Jake discovered that his feelings had crystallized into something surprisingly clear and definite. "I want Aiyana to be free to choose her own path," he said, "and I want to be part of that path if she will have me." The admission surprised Jake almost as much as it seemed to surprise Red Hawk and Aiyana. He had not consciously decided to ask for permission to court the chief's daughter, but something about the intensity of the past few hours had stripped away his usual caution and revealed feelings that he had not even realized he possessed. "You would take an Apache woman as your wife?" Red Hawk asked, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than disapproval. "I would take Aiyana as my wife if she would have me," Jake corrected. "Her being Apache has nothing to do with my feelings for her, except that it has helped me understand that she is even braver and stronger than I thought possible." Red Hawk turned to look at his daughter, whose expression had transformed into something that Jake could only describe as radiant joy mixed with careful hope. "And you, daughter?" the chief asked. "What do you say to this white man's proposal?" Aiyana looked directly at Jake, and in her dark eyes he saw the reflection of everything he had been searching for throughout his years of isolation and independence. "I say that I have found someone who sees me as I truly am rather than as what he wants me to be," she said. "And I would be honored to build a life with such a man." Red Hawk stood in silence for several minutes, and Jake could practically see him weighing the implications of blessing a union that would cross every cultural boundary that had traditionally separated their peoples. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a decision that had been carefully considered and deliberately chosen. "The world is changing," he said, as much to himself as to the others in the cabin. "Perhaps it is time for our people to change with it, rather than being destroyed by our refusal to adapt." He walked to the window and looked out at the snow that was still falling steadily, covering the landscape in a blanket of white that made everything seem new and full of possibilities. "If you two choose to marry," he said, turning back to face them, "you cannot live as Apache and you cannot live as white settlers. You will have to create something new, something that belongs to both worlds and to neither world." "We understand," Jake said, though he suspected that none of them truly comprehended the magnitude of the challenges they would face. "Do you?" Red Hawk asked, and there was something in his voice that suggested he had more to say about the practical realities of their situation. Because Black Bear was not entirely wrong about one thing. There are people on both sides who will see your union as a betrayal of everything they hold sacred. You will have enemies among your own people, Jake, and you will have enemies among mine as well. The sobering reality of that observation settled over all of them like cold water thrown on a fire. Jake had been so focused on the immediate crisis that he had not fully considered the long-term implications of openly committing himself to a relationship that would challenge the prejudices and assumptions of two entire Nadia cultures. "Then we will have to be stronger than our enemies," Aiyana said, taking Jake's hand in her own with a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary. "And we will have to build alliances with people who are ready to accept that love matters more than the color of someone's skin." Red Hawk smiled at his daughter's words, and for the first time since entering the cabin, he looked like a father rather than a chief. "You remind me of your mother," he said softly. "She always believed that the heart knows truths that the mind struggles to accept." He reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew something that glinted in the firelight. Jake realized it was a small silver medallion, clearly of European manufacture but worn smooth by years of handling. "This belonged to your mother," Red Hawk said, offering the medallion to Aiyana. She received it from a Spanish trader who told her that it would bring good fortune to anyone brave enough to build bridges between different worlds. "I think she would want you to have it now." Aiyana accepted the medallion with trembling hands, and Jake could see that the gesture represented far more than a simple gift. It was Red Hawk's way of blessing their relationship and acknowledging that their love might indeed represent the kind of bridge building that the medallion was supposed to encourage. "Thank you, Father," she whispered, and the emotion in her voice told Jake that she understood the full significance of what had just happened. Red Hawk nodded, then addressed both of them with the formal tone of someone making an official pronouncement. "You have my blessing to marry according to whatever customs seem appropriate to you," he said. "But I cannot offer you the protection of our band if you choose to remain in this territory. The tensions between our peoples are too great, and your presence would endanger everyone." Jake had expected this condition, but hearing it stated so clearly still hit him like a physical blow. He had invested years of work and all of his savings in building his life on this land, and walking away from it would mean starting over with nothing but the clothes on his back and the money in his pocket. But as he looked at Aiyana's face and thought about the alternative of losing her to satisfy social conventions that neither of them truly believed in, the choice became surprisingly easy to make. "We understand," he said, "and we accept the consequences of our decision." Red Hawk studied them both for a moment, then gestured to his warriors that it was time to leave. "You should go soon," he advised. "Black Bear will not give up easily. And there are others who will see your relationship as an opportunity to cause trouble for reasons that have nothing to do with either of you personally." "Where should we go?" Aiyana asked. And Jake heard both excitement and apprehension in her voice. "West," Red Hawk replied without hesitation. "California is far enough away to give you a fresh start, and there are communities there where mixed couples can live without constant fear of violence. It will not be easy, but it will be possible." As the chief and his warriors prepared to leave, Jake felt the weight of everything that was about to change settling over him like a heavy blanket. In the space of one night, he had gone from being a solitary rancher focused primarily on his own survival to being half of a couple planning to flee everything familiar in search of a new life in unknown territory. But as Aiyana squeezed his hand and smiled at him with eyes that seemed to hold all the warmth and promise of a summer sunrise, Jake realized that he had never felt more certain about anything in his entire life. Whatever challenges lay ahead of them, they would face those challenges together, and that knowledge gave him a kind of strength that he had never experienced during all his years of determined independence. Red Hawk paused at the door and turned back one final time. "Take care of each other," he said, and his voice carried the blessing of a father and the wisdom of a leader who had learned to see beyond the limitations of his own time and place. "And remember that love is the only force in this world that is stronger than fear." Then he was gone, leaving Jake and Aiyana alone in the cabin, with the fire crackling softly and the storm beginning to subside outside. They stood together in the sudden quiet, still holding hands, both of them trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Are you afraid?" Aiyana asked, and Jake could hear both vulnerability and determination in her voice. "Terrified," he admitted, "but not of the unknown. I am afraid that I will not be worthy of the trust you are placing in me." Aiyana turned to face him fully, and when she spoke, her words carried the kind of absolute conviction that made doubt seem like a luxury neither of them could afford. "You risked your life to protect me from people you did not know for reasons you did not understand," she said. "If that does not make you worthy of my trust, then nothing ever could." Jake pulled her into his arms, and as they held each other beside the dying fire, he felt the last of his old life slipping away like snow melting in the spring sunshine. Tomorrow, they would begin planning their journey to California and their future together. Tonight, they would simply hold each other and marvel at the strange turns that fate had taken to bring them to this moment. Outside, the wind had finally stopped howling, and through the window Jake could see the first faint hints of dawn beginning to lighten the eastern sky. The storm was over, and a new day was beginning, for both of them a day that would be filled with uncertainty and challenge, but also with the kind of love that comes along perhaps once in a lifetime for those fortunate enough to recognize it when it appears. As Jake listened to Aiyana's steady breathing and felt the warmth of her body against his own, He understood that he had found something infinitely more valuable than all the land and cattle and independence he was preparing to leave behind. He had found someone who saw the world through his eyes while helping him see it through hers. Someone who would stand beside him no matter what obstacles the future might place in their path. The fire settled into glowing coals, casting a warm red light across the cabin that would soon be abandoned, but would always be remembered as the place where two people from different worlds discovered that love recognizes no boundaries except those that human beings choose to create and maintain. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate across the snow-covered landscape, and the sound seemed to Jake like a promise that even in the harshest and most unforgiving environment, life finds a way to create beauty and meaning and hope for those brave enough to reach across the darkness toward another beating heart.